Join our community and dive into chilling horror tales that will steal your breath away. Subscribe, ring the notification bell, and brace yourself for a journey into the unknown. The sun was setting over the dense woods of rural Kentucky in the year 1834, and the air carried a weight that no one dared to name. The trees stood like silent witnesses, their gnarled branches twisting toward the heavens as if pleading for answers they would never receive. Somewhere deep within those woods lay the remnants of an old cabin, its walls warped by time and neglected, its roof sagging under the burden of secrets long buried. It was here where it all began. Eleanor had always known there was something wrong with her family, but she could never put her finger on what exactly it was. Her mother, the matriarch of their small household, rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, and even then her words were clipped sharp enough to cut glass. She moved through life as though she were balancing on the edge of a knife, every step deliberate, every breath measured. Eleanor often found herself watching her mother from the corner of her eye, trying to decipher the storm behind those cold gray eyes. But it wasn't just her mother. There was something about the twins too, or rather the absence of them. They had been born 2 years before Eleanor, yet she had no memory of ever seeing them. No photographs, no toys, no whispers of laughter echoing through the halls. Whenever she asked about them, her mother's face would harden like stone, and she would utter only 3 words, "We don't speak of them." Those words became a mantra repeated so often they carved themselves into Eleanor's mind like scars. It wasn't until the night of the storm that everything changed. The rain came down in sheets, drenching the earth and filling the air with the scent of wet soil and decay. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cabin in brief flashes of blinding white light. Inside, Eleanor sat huddled by the fireplace, clutching a quilt around her shoulders, while her mother paced back and forth, her movements jerky and uneven. Something was off tonight more than usual. The tension in the room was almost suffocating, pressing down on Eleanor's chest until she thought she might scream just to break the silence. Then it happened. A sound so faint at first she thought she imagined it. A soft whisper drifting through the cracks in the walls, weaving itself into the howling wind outside. At first Eleanor couldn't make out the words, but as the storm raged on, the voice grew, clearer and louder until it seemed to fill the entire cabin. It was speaking her name over and over again, each syllable dripping with longing and sorrow. Eleanor. Eleanor. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Her mother stopped, pacing mid-step, her head snapping toward the window as though she too had heard the voice. For a moment neither of them moved, locked in a tableau of fear and confusion. Then her mother rushed to the window, yanking the curtains aside to peer into the darkness beyond. The rain blurred the glass, turning the world outside into a swirling mass of shadows and light. "What do you see?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Her mother didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned her face pale and drew her lips pressed into a thin line. She crossed the room in quick strides, kneeling beside Eleanor and gripping her shoulders tightly. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Whatever happens tonight, you must not leave this house. Do you understand? No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you stay here." Eleanor nodded numbly, though her mind raced with questions. What was her mother afraid of? What did she think was out there? As if in response, the whispering grew louder now, accompanied by a strange tapping sound coming from somewhere outside. It was rhythmic, almost like fingers drumming against wood, but faster and sharper. Eleanor's gaze darted toward the door, her stomach churning with dread. The sound was getting closer, moving steadily toward the cabin. Her mother released her shoulders, standing abruptly and grabbing a lantern from the table. "Stay here," she repeated before disappearing into the hallway, leaving Eleanor alone in the flickering firelight. For several minutes, Eleanor sat frozen, listening to the relentless tapping growing louder and louder until it seemed to echo inside her very skull. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the steady patter of rain against the roof. Eleanor held her breath, straining to hear any sign of movement outside or from her mother, who had yet to return. And then she saw it. In the reflection of the darkened window behind the dancing flames of the fire, she caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond the glass. A shadowy figure standing unnaturally still, its shape distorted by the rain-streaked pain. Eleanor's heart leapt into her throat as she stared, transfixed, unable to look away. The figure raised one arm, pointing directly at her, and though she couldn't see its face, she felt its gaze boring into her soul. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet, backing away from the window until her back hit the wall. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. She wanted to call out for her mother, but her voice refused to work, trapped somewhere in the depths of her terror. Then the figure moved. Slowly and deliberately it stepped closer to the window, its form shifting unnaturally as though it weren't entirely solid. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would disappear when she opened them again. But when she did, the figure was still there, closer now, its face pressed against the glass. Its eyes met hers through the distortion, and in that moment Eleanor felt something snap inside her mind. Memories flooded back unbidden, and unwanted images she had no recollection of before now crashing over her like waves. She saw herself as a child playing in the yard, laughing with two smaller figures running alongside her. Twins. One boy, one girl. Their faces blurred, but their presence unmistakable. She remembered holding their hands, feeling safe and loved whole, and then she remembered losing them. The memory shifted abruptly, becoming darker and more fragmented. She saw blood staining the ground, and heard screams tearing through the air, saw her mother dragging her away from the twins, pulling her into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it tight. And she saw the twins reaching out, their hands pressed against the glass, their mouths open in silent pleas. Eleanor gasped, stumbling backward, her legs giving out beneath her. Tears streamed down her face as the realization hit her like a freight train. The twins weren't gone. They were trapped somewhere between worlds, lingering in the spaces between life and death, unable to move on because of what had happened to them. A loud crash jolted her back to reality as the front door flew open, slamming against the wall. Her mother stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, her face twisted with panic. "They're here," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the storm. "They've come for you." Before Eleanor could respond, another sound filled the room, a chorus of whispers overlapping and intertwining until they formed a single haunting melody. The twins' voices calling out to her, begging her to join them, to remember, to set them free. Her mother lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the hallway. "We can't let them take you," she shouted, her grip tightening, painfully. "Not again." Eleanor struggled against her tears streaming down her face as the truth finally broke through the fog of lies and denial. Whatever had happened to the twins, her mother was involved. And now they were back demanding justice. As they reached the staircase leading to the basement, Eleanor's mother paused, her eyes wild with desperation. "I tried to protect you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I did what I had to do." Before Eleanor could respond, the whispers grew louder, transforming into a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the house. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging them into darkness. In the sudden silence, Eleanor heard footsteps ascending the stairs, slow and deliberate, each step echoing like a heartbeat. Her mother released her hand and Eleanor stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet and landing hard on the floor. She looked up just in time to see the basement door creak open, revealing two figures silhouetted against the dim light below. They stepped forward, their faces obscured by shadow, but Eleanor didn't need to see them to know who they were. She felt their presence in every fiber of her being, their pain, their anger, their longing. They reached out, their hands trembling as they stretched toward her, and then the world went black. When Eleanor woke hours later, sunlight streamed through, the windows painting the room in golden hues. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie calm, but as she sat up, rubbing her temples, she realized something was different. The house was empty, silent, as though it had been abandoned for years. She called out for her mother, but her voice echoed unanswered through the empty halls. The basement door remained closed, but when she touched the handle, it burned her skin, forcing her to pull away with a cry of pain. Whatever had happened last night, it wasn't over. And deep down, Eleanor knew the twins weren't done with her either. The veil of whispers. Eleanor woke to the sound of her own breathing, shallow and uneven, as though the air itself was reluctant to fill her lungs. The sunlight streaming through the windows did little to dispel the heaviness that clung to the house like a second skin. It wasn't just emptiness she felt. It was absence. A void so profound it seemed to swallow every ounce of warmth, leaving behind only cold, brittle silence. She stood on shaky legs, her body stiff from the night's ordeal, and moved toward the kitchen. The room was immaculate, untouched by time or neglect. Yet something about it felt wrong. The chairs were perfectly aligned at the table, the dishes stacked neatly in the drying rack. But there was no food on the counters, no scent of coffee brewing. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, preserved but lifeless. Her gaze fell on the mirror hanging above the sink. For a moment she hesitated, afraid of what she might see reflected back at her. When she finally forced herself to look, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and hollow-eyed, but behind her, just over her shoulder, she could see faint outlines of two figures standing motionless, their faces blurred but unmistakably familiar. Eleanor spun around, her heart hammering, but the kitchen was empty. She turned back to the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink for support, and watched as the figures slowly faded into nothingness. Her hands trembled as she reached out to touch the glass, half expecting it to ripple like water under her fingertips. Instead, the surface remained cold and unyielding, a barrier between her world and whatever lay beyond. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes. Time had become slippery, unreliable. Eleanor wandered through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust covering every surface. In the parlor, she found an old photograph tucked inside a drawer of the writing desk. The image was faded, its edges frayed with age, but she recognized the faces immediately. Her mother stood in the center, her expression stern and unreadable, flanked by two small children, twins. Their smiles were bright, innocent, but there was something unsettling about their eyes. They didn't quite meet the camera. Instead, they seemed to be looking past it, as though aware of something lurking just out of frame. Eleanor traced her fingers over the photograph, her chest tightening with grief and guilt. These were her siblings, the twins she had forgotten, or rather the ones she had been made to forget. She couldn't shake the feeling that their presence in the house wasn't accidental. They weren't ghosts haunting her. They were waiting. Waiting for her to remember. Waiting for her to uncover the truth. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The basement. Whatever answers she sought, they were down there, hidden beneath layers of secrets and lies. But the thought of descending into that dark, suffocating space filled her with dread. The memory of the burning doorknob lingered vividly in her mind, a visceral warning etched into her flesh. Still, she knew she couldn't stay trapped in the upper floors forever. The house was shrinking around her, its walls closing in with each passing hour. Shadows danced along the corners of her vision, shifting and writhing like living things, and then there were the whispers growing louder with every step she took, weaving themselves into her thoughts until she could no longer tell where they ended and her own voice began. "You can't run," they murmured, soft and insistent. "You belong here." Eleanor clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. She grabbed a lantern from the mantel and lit it, the flame casting flickering light across the walls. With trembling hands, she approached the basement door once more. This time, when she touched the handle, it was cool to the touch. Inviting almost. She hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open and descended into the abyss. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, each step echoing ominously in the narrow stairwell. The air grew colder the deeper she went, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. At the bottom, she found herself in a dimly lit corridor lined with shelves stacked high with jars and boxes. Dust coated everything, muffling the sound of her footsteps as she moved cautiously forward. Her lantern illuminated fragments of the past, old letters tied with ribbon, yellowed pages torn from books, trinkets whose purpose she couldn't begin to guess. But it was the far wall that drew her attention. Unlike the rest of the basement, this section was clean, meticulously organized. Rows of framed photographs hung side by side, each one depicting the same two children at different stages of their lives. Beneath them sat a collection of objects, dolls with cracked porcelain faces, a music box missing its lid, a pair of tiny shoes worn smooth with use. Eleanor reached out to touch one of the frames, her fingers brushing against the glass. As soon as she did, the whispers erupted into a deafening crescendo, drowning out all other sounds. Images flashed before her eyes, disjointed and chaotic. A boy and girl playing in a field, laughing as they chased fireflies. A storm rolling in, lightning illuminating their terrified faces, blood pooling on the ground, staining the grass crimson. And then she saw it, the act that had sealed their fate. Her mother standing over the twins with a knife in her hand, her face twisted with anguish. The scene played out in slow motion, the blade descending again and again until the twins collapsed, their cries fading into silence. Eleanor stumbled, backward, dropping the lantern. The flame sputtered but didn't go out, casting grotesque shadows across the walls. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be real." But it was. Every detail burned itself into her mind, refusing to let go. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face as the weight of the truth crushed her. Her mother hadn't protected her from the twins. She had taken them away, murdered them, and now they were trapped, unable to move on because of what she had done. A soft giggle broke the silence, pulling Eleanor back to the present. She looked up, her breath hitching as she saw the twins standing at the far end of the corridor. They were younger than she remembered, their faces pale and translucent, their eyes wide with sorrow. They held hands, swaying gently as though caught in some invisible current. "We've waited for you," the girl said, her voice barely audible over the pounding in Eleanor's ears. "You have to help us," the boy added, his tone pleading. "Make it right." Eleanor wanted to scream, to deny what she was seeing, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded, her resolve hardening despite the terror coursing through her veins. She didn't know how she would fix this, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't leave them here any longer. As she rose to her feet, the twins vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers and the echo of their laughter. The basement felt heavier now, as though the very air had thickened with anticipation. Eleanor gripped the lantern tightly and turned back toward the stairs, her mind racing with possibilities. But as she climbed upward, she realized something was different. The house was no longer silent. Faint voices drifted from the rooms above, overlapping and indistinct yet undeniably human. She froze, listening intently, her pulse quickening. Someone, or something, was upstairs, and it wasn't alone. Eleanor's ascent up the basement stairs was agonizingly slow, each creak of the wooden steps amplifying the dread pooling in her stomach. The voices above were faint but unmistakable, a cacophony of whispers overlapping and intertwining like a chorus of ghosts. They weren't just random sounds. They carried fragments of sentences, snippets of conversations that felt eerily familiar. "Should have stayed. You can't escape us. We've been waiting." She clutched the lantern tighter, its flame trembling as though it too sensed the unnatural presence filling the house. Her breath came in shallow gasps, fogging in the cold air as she reached the top step. The door leading to the kitchen stood ajar, spilling dim light into the stairwell. Beyond it, shadows danced erratically across the walls, their movements too fluid to be natural. Eleanor hesitated, her body frozen between fight and flight. She could turn back, retreat to the basement and lock herself away, but something deep inside told her that running wouldn't help. Whatever was happening here, it had already begun, and now it wanted her to see. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed the door open wider and stepped into the kitchen. The room looked different, somehow, not physically but in atmosphere. The furniture seemed heavier, darker, as if weighed down by unseen forces. Even the mirror above the sink appeared altered, its surface clouded with streaks of gray mist that swirled lazily within the glass. The voices grew louder, converging into a single voice, one she recognized immediately. It was her mother's, low and strained, speaking words Eleanor couldn't quite make out. She followed the sound cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust coating the floorboards. As she entered the parlor, The scene before her stopped her dead in her tracks. Her mother sat in the center of the room, hunched over the writing desk, her hands trembling as she scribbled furiously on a sheet of paper. But it wasn't her mother. Not entirely. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken as though she hadn't slept in weeks. Around her, the air shimmered unnaturally, distorting the edges of reality like heat rising off pavement. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking on shapes that resembled human figures, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she watched in stunned silence as one of the shadowy figures detached itself from the wall and moved toward her mother. It hovered behind her, leaning close until its faceless form nearly touched hers. Then, without warning, it plunged its arm straight through her chest. Her mother gasped, her pen falling from her hand as she doubled over in pain. For a moment, nothing happened, then her body began to convulse violently, her lips moving soundlessly as tears streamed down her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice was not her own. It was deeper, harsher, layered with multiple tones that grated against Eleanor's ears. "They know," the voice hissed, echoing through the room. "They always knew." Eleanor stumbled backward, her mind reeling. What was happening? Was this some kind of possession? A punishment for what her mother had done? She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot. By sheer terror. The shadow figure withdrew its arm, leaving her mother slumped forward in her chair. It turned slowly, its head tilting unnaturally as it fixed its gaze on Eleanor. Though it had no eyes, she felt its attention pierce through her like a blade, freezing her blood in her veins. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "This isn't your burden to bear." Before Eleanor could respond, the figure lunged at her, its form dissolving into smoke as it surged forward. She threw up her arms instinctively, bracing for impact. But instead of colliding with her, the smoke passed right through her body, seeping into her, skin like ice-cold water. She cried out, clutching her chest as a wave of nausea overwhelmed her. Images flooded her mind. Flashes of her childhood, memories buried so deeply she hadn't even realized they existed. She saw herself as a toddler, playing in the yard with the twins. Their laughter rang clear and pure, untainted by fear or sorrow. She remembered sitting cross-legged on the grass, braiding daisies into garlands while the boy chased butterflies and the girl hummed a tune she'd learned from their mother. There was love there, undeniable and fierce, a bond so strong it defied death itself. But then the memories shifted, darkening like storm clouds rolling in. She saw her mother standing over the twins, her face twisted with grief and rage. The knife glinted in the moonlight as it arced downward again and again, until the laughter turned to screams. Eleanor felt the weight of those screams pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, dragging her into an abyss of guilt and despair. When the visions finally subsided, she found herself collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her mother was still seated at the desk, her head bowed as though oblivious to everything around her. The shadow figures had vanished, leaving behind only an oppressive silence that filled the room like a tangible force. Eleanor didn't know how long she lay there, curled into a ball as the truth settled over her like a shroud. Her mother had killed the twins, that much was certain. But why? What could have driven her to such an act? And why had she erased their existence from Eleanor's memory? As these questions churned in her mind, another realization dawned on her. The house itself was complicit. Its walls held secrets, its floors bore witness to atrocities committed within. Every creak, every groan, every whisper, it all served a purpose, feeding off the pain and suffering trapped inside. She forced herself to stand, wiping her tears with shaking hands. If she wanted answers, she would have to confront the source of the nightmare head-on, and she knew exactly where to start. The mirror. Returning to the kitchen, she approached the reflective surface cautiously, her heart pounding in anticipation. Up close, the swirling mist within the glass seemed alive, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her palm flat against the cool surface. The world tilted sideways, When Eleanor opened her eyes, she wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She stood in a vast, desolate field under a sky painted in shades of crimson and gold. The air was thick with the scent of earth and wildflowers, yet there was an underlying tang of something metallic. Blood. In the distance, she could see two small figures walking hand in hand, their backs turned to her. "Wait!" she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. The figures paused but didn't turn around. Slowly, she began to walk toward them, her feet sinking slightly into the soft soil beneath her. As she drew closer, she realized they weren't children anymore. They were older now, teenagers perhaps, their features more defined yet still tinged with an ethereal quality. When they finally turned to face her, Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Their eyes were empty voids, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. "We've been waiting for you," the girl said softly, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "You're the only one who can set us free." "How?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do I need to do?" The boy stepped forward, reaching out a hand. His touch was icy, sending shivers down her spine. "Find the truth," he said simply, "and destroy the lie." Before she could ask what he meant, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The sky darkened rapidly, clouds churning as thunder rumbled in the distance. The twins' forms started to fade, their outlines blurring until they disappeared entirely. Eleanor woke with a start, sprawled on the kitchen floor. The mirror above the sink was cracked, its surface fractured into a spiderweb of lines. She stared at it, her reflection distorted and fragmented, and knew one thing for certain. The house wasn't done with her yet. When Eleanor regained her senses, the air in the kitchen felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The cracked mirror above the sink loomed over her like a fractured eye, its jagged lines reflecting not just her own distorted image but something else, shapes that moved just beyond the surface, too fast to discern. She pushed herself upright, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear, yet driven by an unrelenting pull toward the truth. The house was alive now, not merely haunted, but sentient. Every creak of the floorboards seemed deliberate, every flicker of shadow calculated. It wasn't just showing her things anymore. It was testing her resolve, probing for weakness. And Eleanor knew she couldn't afford to falter. Not when the twins' voices still echoed in her mind, pleading for release. She turned her attention back to the mirror, staring at the cracks that spiderwebbed across its surface. Something about it unsettled her more than anything else in this nightmare. It wasn't just broken glass, it was a gateway, a threshold between worlds. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and hollow-eyed, but behind her shoulder, faint outlines of figures began to form once again. This time, however, they weren't twins. They were strangers. Men and women dressed in tattered clothing, their faces gaunt and sorrowful. Their mouths moved silently, forming words Eleanor couldn't hear, but their eyes held a message clear enough. "You're running out of time." With a shudder, she stepped away from the mirror, her mind racing. Destroying the lie, the boy's words reverberated in her thoughts. What did he mean? What lie had been told, and how could she dismantle it? The answer lay somewhere within these walls, buried beneath layers of guilt, grief, and denial. But where to start? Her gaze fell on the writing desk in the parlor. Whatever her mother had been frantically scribbling before the shadow consumed her, it might hold a clue. Gathering what little courage remained, Eleanor crossed the threshold into the parlor, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust coating the floor. The room was eerily quiet now, the oppressive energy that had filled it earlier replaced by an almost suffocating stillness. Even the shadows seemed dormant, clinging to the corners like sleeping predators. Her mother sat exactly where Eleanor had left her, slumped forward in the chair, her pen lying abandoned on the desk. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to approach or retreat. Then, steeling herself, she moved closer, her eyes scanning the papers scattered across the surface. At first glance, they appeared to be letters, pages filled with frantic handwriting, some smudged with tears, others torn halfway through sentences. Most of them began the same way. "Forgive me." Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked up one of the pages, her eyes scanning the cramped script. Her mother wrote, of regret, of unbearable choices made in desperation. She spoke of the twins not as innocent children but as vessels, conduits for something ancient and malevolent that had taken root in their bloodline generations ago. According to her writings, the family had long been cursed, plagued by visions and voices that drove them to madness. The twins had inherited this curse more strongly than anyone before them, their connection to the other side growing stronger with each passing day. They would have destroyed us all, her mother wrote in one particularly harrowing passage. I had no choice. I had to stop them before they brought ruin upon everyone we loved. Eleanor's stomach churned as she read, bile rising in her throat. Was this why her mother had killed them? To protect the family from some unseen evil? Or was it merely an excuse, a justification for an unforgivable act? As she sifted through the letters, another piece of paper caught her eye. Unlike the others, this one was written in a different hand, neater, more deliberate. At the top of the page, a single phrase stood out, inked in bold strokes, the ritual of severance. Below it, detailed instructions described a ceremony meant to sever ties between the living and the dead, banishing spirits trapped between worlds. The ritual required specific items, a lock of hair from each twin, a shard of black obsidian, and a vial of salt water blessed under a full moon, and culminated in the breaking of a reflective object tied to the cursed soul. Eleanor's breath hitched. The mirror. It had to be the mirror. But there was a catch. The final step of the ritual demanded a confession, a truthful admission of guilt spoken aloud in front of witnesses. Only then could the curse be lifted and the souls set free. Her mind raced. If the mirror was indeed the key to freeing the twins, then destroying it was essential. But doing so meant confronting her mother, not just physically but emotionally. Could she force her mother to admit what she had done? And even if she succeeded, would it be enough to undo decades of suffering? Before she could dwell further on the implications, a sharp noise jolted her from her thoughts. A crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving rapidly across the floorboards. Her heart leapt into her throat as she realized someone, or something, was in the house with her. Clutching the ritual instructions tightly, she crept toward the staircase, her pulse pounding in her ears. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low murmurs that sent chills down her spine. As she reached the base of the stairs, a figure appeared at the top landing. It wasn't human. Its form was indistinct, shifting constantly between shapes. A man, a woman, a child, then nothing at all. Its face was featureless, smooth and white like porcelain, yet it radiated an aura of malice so potent it made the air taste bitter. When it spoke, its voice was layered, a chorus of tones that grated against Eleanor's sanity. You shouldn't have come back, it hissed, descending the stairs with unnatural grace. This isn't your fight. Eleanor backed away, her mind screaming at her to run, but her feet refused to obey. The creature moved closer, its presence pressing down on her like a physical weight. She could feel its breath, cold and damp, against her skin, smell the decay clinging to it like rotting flowers. You don't understand, she whispered, clutching the ritual paper like a lifeline. I'm trying to help them. I'm trying to fix this. The creature tilted its head, studying her with an intensity that made her want to scream. Then, without warning, it lunged, its form dissolving into smoke as it surged forward. Eleanor threw up her arms instinctively, bracing for impact. But instead of colliding with her, the smoke passed right through her body, seeping into her skin like ice-cold water. Pain exploded in her chest, sharp and searing, as images flooded her mind once again. She saw flashes of her childhood, her mother standing over the twins, the knife gleaming in the moonlight. But this time the memory shifted, revealing details she hadn't noticed before. Behind her mother stood another figure, cloaked in shadow, whispering encouragement in a voice that sounded eerily familiar. It was her own. Eleanor gasped, stumbling backward as the vision faded. The creature reformed several feet away, watching her with an expression of cruel satisfaction. "You already know the truth," it said softly. "Now you must decide what to do with it." And with that, it vanished, leaving Eleanor alone in the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't have much time. Whatever the creature was, it wasn't acting alone. The house itself seemed to be waking up, responding to her discovery of the ritual. The temperature dropped sharply, frost creeping along the walls as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. Eleanor tightened her grip on the ritual paper and turned back toward the parlor. Her mother was still seated at the desk, unmoving, her head bowed as though lost in prayer. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor approached her slowly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Mother," she said softly, "we need to talk." Her mother didn't respond, but Eleanor didn't expect her to. This wasn't going to be easy, but if she wanted to save the twins, and herself, she had no choice. The air in the parlor was thick with tension, each breath Eleanor took feeling heavier than the last. Her mother sat motionless at the desk, her posture rigid, as though frozen in time. The faint glow of the lantern cast long shadows across her face, highlighting the deep lines etched into her skin, lines that spoke of years spent carrying a burden too heavy for any one person to bear. Eleanor stood before her, the ritual instructions clutched tightly in her hand. She could feel the weight of them, not just physically but emotionally, as if the paper itself were imbued with the gravity of what she was about to demand. This moment would change everything. There was no turning back now. "Mother," Eleanor repeated, her voice firmer this time, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "I know what you did." Her mother flinched, ever so slightly, but didn't look up. Instead, she remained still, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, knuckles white from the strain. For a moment, Eleanor thought she might refuse to acknowledge her entirely. But then, slowly, painfully, her mother raised her head, meeting Eleanor's gaze with eyes that brimmed with guilt and despair. "How much do you know?" her mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper, cracked and brittle like old parchment. "I know about the twins," Eleanor replied, her tone unwavering despite the storm raging inside her chest. "I know they weren't just children. They were cursed, and I know you killed them because you thought it was the only way to protect us." Her mother's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks unchecked. She looked away, unable to hold Eleanor's stare, and let out a shuddering sigh. "You don't understand," she murmured, shaking her head. "It wasn't just about protecting us, it was about stopping them. They were different. Special. Too special. The voices, the visions. It started when they were babies. By the time they were toddlers, they could see things no child should ever see. They talked to people who weren't there, played with toys that moved on their own. At first I thought it was harmless, just an overactive imagination. But then, she trailed off, her voice breaking under the weight of memories too painful to relive. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding, knowing instinctively that whatever came next would be the key to unlocking the truth. "They began to change," her mother continued after a long pause. "Their laughter turned hollow, their smiles wrong, somehow. One night I woke to find them standing outside my bedroom door, holding hands and staring at me with eyes that weren't theirs. They said they had seen the other side, that it was beautiful, inviting, and that soon we'd all join them there." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine, her body reacting even as her mind struggled to process the words. "What happened after that?" Her mother hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "I tried everything, took them to doctors, priests, anyone who might help. But nothing worked. If anything, it got worse. The house, it changed around them. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Doors opened and closed by themselves. And the whispers," she shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as though trying to ward off the memory. "The whispers never stopped. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. So, you decided to kill them? Her mother's head snapped up, her expression raw with anguish. I didn't want to, she cried, her voice rising sharply. But what choice did I have? They weren't my children anymore. Not really. Something else was wearing their faces, using their bodies. I couldn't let them destroy us all. I couldn't let them drag our family into whatever hellish place they were connected to. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the weight of her mother's confession settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Eleanor wanted to scream, to rail against the injustice of it all, but she knew anger wouldn't solve anything. Not now. Instead, she knelt beside her mother, placing a trembling hand on hers. We can fix this, she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. There's a way to free them, to break the curse and send their souls to rest. But I need your help. We have to perform the ritual. Her mother stared at her, her eyes wide with disbelief. The ritual of severance, she whispered, her voice tinged with both hope and dread. How do you know about that? It doesn't matter how I know, Eleanor replied firmly. What matters is that we do it. Together. Her mother shook, her head violently, pulling her hand away as though burned. No, she said, her voice cracking. I won't risk it. The ritual, it's dangerous. If we fail, the consequences will be worse than anything you can imagine. We don't have a choice, Eleanor insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. The twins are trapped here suffering because of what you did. And this house, it's feeding off their pain. It won't stop until we end it. Her mother's shoulders slumped, defeat written plainly across her features. For a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw something flicker in her mother's eyes, regret, perhaps, or maybe even gratitude. But it was gone too quickly to be. Sure, fine, her mother finally conceded, her voice barely audible. But if we're going to do this, we do it my way. No shortcuts, no mistakes. The preparations began immediately. Using the ritual instructions as a guide, they gathered the necessary items. A lock of hair from each twin, taken from an old locket hidden in the attic, a shard of black obsidian found buried beneath the floorboards in the basement, and a vial of salt water blessed under a full moon. The final component, the reflective object tied to the cursed soul, was already waiting for them in the kitchen. As they worked, the house seemed to grow restless, responding to their actions with increasing hostility. The temperature plummeted, frost spreading across the windows like icy veins. Whispers echoed through the halls, growing, louder and more insistent with each passing minute. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking on shapes that resembled human figures, before dissolving into smoke. When everything was ready, they returned to the kitchen, the cracked mirror looming over them like a malevolent eye. Eleanor placed the items on the table, arranging them carefully according to the ritual's specifications. Her mother stood beside her, clutching the shard of obsidian in one hand and the vial of salt water in the other, her face pale but resolute. This is it, her mother said quietly, her voice trembling. Once we start, there's no going back. Eleanor nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. Let's finish this. They began the ritual, reciting the incantation written on the paper in unison. Their voices mingled, creating a haunting melody that filled the room and reverberated through the house. As they spoke, the mirror began to shimmer, its surface rippling like liquid silver. The cracks widened, glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. Then, without warning, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar, shaking the very foundation of the house. Shadows surged forward, coalescing into a single monstrous form that loomed over them, its featureless face twisted with rage. You think you can undo what has been done, it snarled, its voice layered with countless others. You cannot escape the truth. Eleanor faltered, fear gripping her heart, but her mother stepped forward, holding the shard of obsidian aloft. Leave us, she commanded, her voice laced with authority. Your power ends here. The creature lunged, its form dissolving into smoke as it surged toward them. But before it could reach them, her mother hurled the shard at the mirror, striking it dead center. The glass shattered instantly, shards exploding outward in every direction. A blinding flash of light engulfed the room, followed by a deafening crack like thunder. When the light faded, the house was silent. Eleanor blinked, disoriented, her ears ringing from the explosion. Her mother stood beside her, breathing heavily, her face streaked with tears. In the corner of the room, two figures materialized. The twins, whole and radiant, their eyes clear and filled with peace. "We're free," the girl whispered, smiling, softly. "Thank you." And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of wildflowers. But as Eleanor turned to embrace her mother, she realized something was wrong. Her mother's expression had grown distant, her body swaying unsteadily. Before Eleanor could react, her mother collapsed to the floor, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "No!" Eleanor screamed, dropping to her knees beside her. But it was too late. The house exhaled, a long, low sigh, and fell silent once more. The silence that followed was deafening, a void so profound it seemed to swallow every sound in the house. Eleanor knelt beside her mother's lifeless body, her hands trembling as they hovered over the still form. Tears streamed down her face, but no sobs escaped her lips. Grief had hollowed her out, leaving only a raw ache that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She wanted to scream, to demand answers from the empty air. Why had this happened? Why had her mother sacrificed herself after everything they'd endured? But deep down, Eleanor already knew. The ritual hadn't just freed the twins, it had claimed a price. And her mother, burdened by guilt and regret for decades, had chosen to pay it willingly. As she sat there, the weight of the house pressing down on her like an invisible hand, something shifted. The oppressive energy that had filled the space since she first stepped inside dissipated, replaced by an almost serene stillness. The frost melted from the windows, the shadows receded into the corners, and the whispers ceased entirely. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Eleanor could breathe without feeling the suffocating presence of the past clinging to her lungs. But the peace was fleeting, or perhaps illusory. As she rose to her feet, brushing tears from her cheeks, she noticed something strange about the shards of the shattered mirror scattered across the floor. They weren't reflecting light anymore. Instead, their surfaces shimmered faintly like pools of liquid mercury, each fragment showing glimpses of scenes Eleanor didn't recognize. Fields bathed in golden sunlight, laughter ringing through, open spaces, faces smiling warmly at one another. It was beautiful, but unsettling too, because none of it belonged to her memories. Her gaze lingered on one shard in particular, its image clearer than the others. She saw herself as a child, sitting cross-legged on the grass alongside the twins. Their smiles were radiant, their eyes bright with innocence. Behind them stood their mother, not the broken woman Eleanor had known, but someone else entirely. This version of her mother was younger, her face unlined by sorrow, her expression soft and full of love. She watched over the children protectively, yet with a quiet joy that radiated from within. Eleanor reached for the shard, her fingers brushing against its cool surface. As soon as she touched it, the room tilted sideways, pulling her into another vision. She found herself standing in the same field she'd seen in the mirror shard, the sky above painted in hues of amber and lavender. The air smelled sweet, like wildflowers and fresh earth, and the ground beneath her feet was warm and inviting. In the distance, she spotted the twins again, sitting beneath a sprawling oak tree, their heads bent together as they whispered conspiratorially. When they noticed her approach, they turned, their expressions lighting up with recognition. "You did it," the boy said, his voice tinged with awe. "You set us free." Eleanor shook her head, her chest tightening with emotion. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Her voice cracked as she gestured toward where her mother's body lay back in the real world. "She shouldn't have had to die." The girl stood, taking a step closer. Her movements were gentle, almost ethereal, as though she existed somewhere between worlds. She chose this, she said softly. She carried the guilt for so long, believing she deserved nothing less than punishment. But now she's finally at peace. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the moisture pooling in her eyes. And you? Are you really free? The boy nodded, rising to join his sister. We are. Thanks to you, we can move on to whatever comes next. Before Eleanor could respond, the twins stepped forward, reaching out to take her hands. Their touch was warm, comforting, unlike the icy grip of the shadows that had haunted her throughout the ordeal. A wave of calm washed over her, easing the tension in her muscles and soothing the storm in her mind. For the first time in days, weeks, maybe even years, she felt whole. We'll always be with you, the girl murmured, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. Not as ghosts or echoes, but as memories. Hold on to them and we'll never truly leave. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into golden light that drifted upward, merging with the setting sun. Eleanor watched until the last traces vanished, leaving her alone in the field. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the kitchen, kneeling amidst the shards of the shattered mirror. The visions were gone, but their impact lingered, etched into her soul like scars healed over but never forgotten. She glanced at her mother's body, her heart heavy with loss, yet buoyed by the knowledge that her sacrifice hadn't been in vain. Slowly, Eleanor stood, gathering the strength to face what came next. She knew she couldn't stay here, not in this house, not with the ghosts of the past still lingering in its walls. But as she prepared to leave, she paused, turning back to the table where the ritual items remained. Among them lay the old photograph she'd discovered earlier, the one depicting her mother flanked by the twins. Picking it up, she studied it closely, committing every detail to memory before slipping it into her pocket. Taking one final look, around the room, Eleanor stepped outside, closing the door behind her. The morning sun broke through the trees, casting dappled light across the yard. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with fresh air, untainted by decay or despair. The house loomed behind her, silent and still, but she refused to look back. As she walked away, she realized something. The curse wasn't entirely broken. While the twins had been freed, the legacy of pain and guilt would remain etched into her family's history, a reminder of the choices made and the lives lost. But perhaps that was the point. To forget would be to erase them completely, to let their suffering vanish without meaning. By remembering, she honored their existence, even if it meant carrying the weight of their story with her forever. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, the house had disappeared from view, swallowed by the dense foliage. Yet Eleanor could feel its presence lingering, a faint echo of the horrors and truths it had harbored. She didn't know what lay ahead for her, whether she'd find solace or continue to grapple with the trauma of what she'd endured. But one thing was certain, she would never speak of the twins again. Not because she feared them, but because their story belonged to her now. A secret buried not out of shame, but reverence. A haunting reminder that some truths are too fragile and too precious to share with the world. And as she disappeared into the trees, the wind carried a single whisper, soft and fleeting. Thank you. The end.